The young waitress wiped the tables and cleared plates and cups at Harper's Diner for what felt like the 100th time that day, when the most luxurious car she had ever seen slowly rolled into the gravel parking lot. Working there was no dream choice, but it was what kept the bills paid one way or another. What Ella Monroe could never have imagined was that, on that ordinary afternoon, a billionaire CEO would walk through the door of that simple place and sign a check with handwriting impossible to forget. That signature was not just any. It was identical to the one Waitress Ella had known since she was 8 years old, sketched on the back of an old photograph she kept in secret. The same elegant stroke that, according to her mother, belonged to the man who had died before she was even born. The man who should have been her father. Before we continue this story, I want to know, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed the way you see life? Share it in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more emotional stories like this one. Now, let me take you back to that afternoon that seemed ordinary for a roadside waitress. An afternoon that began like all the others, but would end up turning her life upside down. Ella was only 23 and believed her life was already mapped out. Every morning she arrived early at Harper's Diner, helped prepare the place for the breakfast rush, and spent hours serving weary truckers, hurried travelers, and retirees who came more for the cheap coffee than the food. The red vinyl booths and checkered floor seemed unchanged since the 1980s, and perhaps it was exactly that which gave the place its sense of familiarity. The pay was low, but the tips, when generous, were enough to cover tuition at the community college where she studied pastry arts. The dream was simple: save money, transfer to a larger university in Atlanta, and one day open her own bakery. To many, it might sound small. But for a simple waitress, it was the hope of a life different from the routine of heavy trays and sleepless nights. At home, she shared a small apartment with her mother, Mary Ann. A strong woman, her hands marked by years of sewing, who had raised her daughter alone since before her birth. Ella had grown up hearing that her father had died in a tragic fire, still young, before he even knew about the pregnancy. That had always been the official story. But Ella kept a secret she had never revealed to her mother. At the age of 8, rummaging through old books, she had found a yellowed photograph hidden at the bottom of a box. In it, a teenage couple smiled by the edge of a lake. The girl was unmistakable, Mary Ann, very young, with the same sparkle in her eyes Ella had learned to recognize over time. Beside her, a boy who seemed to radiate life. On the back, in firm and elegant handwriting, were the words, "Mary Ann, you will always be my world. William." Ella never managed to forget that stroke. The signature was so striking that, over the years, she came to reproduce it in her mind effortlessly, as if it were part of her. She kept the photograph in secret, hidden in her memory box, and never again touched the subject with her mother. Perhaps out of fear of reopening wounds, perhaps afraid of hearing a truth she was not ready to face. The waitress's days at Harper's Diner were almost always the same, but every detail became part of a silent choreography she had learned by heart. The smell of bacon on the griddle mixed with the aroma of strong coffee, creating a constant haze that clung to her clothes and hair. She moved swiftly between the booths, balancing heavy trays with discreet grace, while offering smiles that often concealed her exhaustion. At home, Ella's relationship with Mary Ann was built on small gestures that carried great meaning. Her mother always left a cup of tea waiting on the table when Ella came home late, and the daughter, in turn, helped sew buttons or organize fabrics whenever she saw her mother exhausted. They were not ones for grand declarations, but their love was woven into the details, in the care, in the patience, in the silence they shared after a difficult day. And so the days went by, one after another, always the same. Between crowded tables, hurried conversations, and the constant smell of freshly brewed coffee, the young waitress's life seemed condemned to repetition. On that sultry Tuesday, nothing suggested it would be any different. She waited tables, smiled at regular customers, and carried trays as usual. But fate, silent and precise, was preparing a turn of events she could never have anticipated. It was exactly 10 o'clock when the sound of tires on gravel made Ella raise her eyes. The car that stopped in front of Harper's Diner clashed with everything around it, gleaming black, tinted windows, modern lines that reflected the sunlight as if the vehicle had just rolled out of a luxury showroom. The regular customers paused their conversations for a moment, silently watching the unlikely sight of such a car parking among rusty pickup trucks. The door opened, and a man appeared. Tall, with a commanding presence, he wore an impeccable dark suit that looked tailor-made. His carefully combed gray hair and upright posture conveyed more than wealth, there was authority in every step he took. When he entered through the glass door, he seemed out of place in that simple space, yet at the same time he filled the room with a kind of confidence that drew every gaze to him. Ella pretended to be focused on arranging cups at the counter but couldn't help glancing at him. The manager hurried over, calling her in a low voice. "Corner booth, Ella." He asked for privacy. "He'll pay well for it. Just make sure the coffee never runs out." She simply nodded, took a deep breath, and grabbed a pot of fresh coffee. The man walked to the reserved booth, sitting on the vinyl seat like someone unaccustomed to such modest surroundings. He looked around quickly, evaluating the space, and when his eyes met hers for an instant, Ella felt an inexplicable unease. He thanked her politely when he received the menu, and his deep, steady voice seemed to carry years of command and important decisions. Shortly after, another man in a suit arrived, probably a lawyer, and the two dove into hushed conversations, leaning over a folder brimming with documents. Ella carried on with her routine, refilling cups, bringing water, keeping her distance to avoid intruding on their privacy. Yet as she watched him discreetly, a strange sensation unsettled her. It wasn't just his authority or elegance. There was something about that man that seemed far too familiar. The meeting went on in hushed murmurs. Papers slid back and forth across the table while the lawyer pointed out figures and clauses with the tip of his pen. Ella kept her distance, but she couldn't help stealing quick glances toward the corner booth, always alert for the moment she would need to refill another cup of coffee. And then it happened. William Prescott pulled a golden pen from the inner pocket of his jacket and, with steady movements, lowered his wrist over the contract. The silence of the diner seemed to tighten in that instant, as though everything else around had lost its importance. The tip of the pen glided across the paper, and before Ella's eyes, it traced handwriting so familiar that her whole body froze. Her breath caught. Her hands, still holding a tray of plates and cups, began to tremble. The clash of metal against porcelain was the inevitable signal. The tray slipped, crashing to the floor with a clatter that made every customer turn their heads. Glasses shattered, the sharp, cutting sound echoing through the room. Ella crouched down immediately, trying to gather the shards, mumbling apologies, but her eyes refused to part from what she had just seen. The wide, commanding W, followed by elegant, fluid curves. The same stroke she had traced for years with her fingers on a faded photograph hidden in her memory box. It was impossible to be mistaken. That signature was the same one that once accompanied a declaration of love written on the back of an old photograph. The same signature her mother had never wanted to explain. Ella swallowed hard, her heart racing, while the truth, or something very close to it, threatened to rise from a past she had always believed buried. Her heart seemed to beat out of rhythm, as if she had lost control of her own body. The sound of the shattered glass still rang in her ears, but it was a distant noise compared to the crushing weight of the memory. Her mind replayed every detail of the hidden photograph, Marianne's youthful smile, the boy with the intense gaze, and that unmistakable flourish on the back of the image. It was impossible for it to be a coincidence. Cold sweat slid down her neck, strands of hair clinging to her skin. Ella wondered if she was losing her mind, if her eyes had deceived her. But the longer she looked at the freshly written signature, the more certain she became that she was holding in her hands the fragment of a truth that had always been waiting for her. Her legs shook so violently that each step felt dragged, as if she had been thrown onto a stage where the curtain had risen without warning. And now, before a silent audience, she had to speak words that could change her entire life. Ella took a deep breath, her hands still damp from the rag she pretended to use to wipe down the table nearby. Each step toward the booth felt unbearably heavy, as if gravity itself had chosen to test her courage. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared the two men at the table might hear it. But there was no turning back. Not after seeing that signature. She approached slowly, her trembling fingers clutching the order pad, and her voice came out almost as a whisper. That is my father's signature." William Prescott lifted his eyes, startled, as if suddenly noticing the young woman's presence for the first time. The lawyer leaned back, intrigued, but it was the silence settling over the table that made the air impossible to breathe. The magnate stared at her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The pen still rested between his fingers, but he did not move. "What did you say?" His deep voice sounded lower than before, almost hesitant. Ella drew in a breath, trying to steady herself. "That signature. It's identical to the one belonging to the man my mother said had died before I was born. His name was William." For a moment he remained still, as if trying to reorganize long-buried memories. His eyes studied her with sudden intensity, the shade of her hair, the color of her eyes, the line of her face. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 23, she answered, swallowing hard. The silence that followed seemed endless. Ella felt his gaze sweep over every feature of her face as though searching for hidden proof, a reflection lost in time. The weight of his stare made her shiver. Suddenly, this was no longer just a conversation in a diner, it was as if 2 decades of invisible history had been compressed into that moment. Ella thought of how many times she had dreamed of having a father figure, someone who would show up at school plays or hold her hand in moments of fear. And now, standing before her, was a man who could be that someone, but also the same man who had been absent all her life. Her mind swung between anger and hope. She wanted to scream, to cry, to embrace him and push him away all at once. Every emotion seemed to fight for space inside a heart that no longer knew what to feel. "And your mother's name?" "Marianne. Marianne Monroe." The golden pen slipped from his fingers and fell onto the table, rolling until it came to rest in the heavy silence that followed. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the contract. His eyes, once steady and impenetrable, now reflected something between pain and astonishment. "My God," he murmured, almost voiceless. You are my daughter." On the other side of the city, in a world completely distant from Ella's, William Prescott occupied one of the top floors of a glass tower in Atlanta. At 50, he was known as one of the most influential CEOs on the East Coast, owner of an investment empire that controlled everything from luxury hotels to tech ventures. His image in the press was always impeccable: bespoke suit, calculated gaze, and a reputation forged in discipline. To the business world, William was a man of swift, cold decisions, someone who saw numbers where others saw risks. But behind the figure of the magnate lay a personal silence no one knew. He had never married, and the few relationships he'd had were discreet and brief, as if nothing could fill the empty space he himself could not name. The press described him as ruthless, his partners admired him as a visionary, and his rivals feared him. Yet in the nights when he was alone in his luxurious penthouse, William wondered if any of it was worth it. Success had given him power and fortune, but not the answers to the questions that sometimes struck him in silence. Why, despite it all, did the emptiness never leave him? The way home felt endless. Ella could barely feel the weight of her own steps as she climbed the narrow staircase of the old building. When she finally turned the key and stepped into the small apartment, her heart was still pounding as if it might tear through her chest. She sat down at the kitchen table, the old photograph in front of her, waiting for the moment the door would open. And it didn't take long. Shortly after 6, Marianne came in, exhausted, her bag slipping off her shoulder and her hands marked by another day of sewing. Seeing her daughter sitting there, motionless, staring ahead, she hesitated. "Ella? What happened? You're pale." Ella slowly lifted the photo, letting the weak light from the lamp fall across the handwriting on the back. "Mom, we need to talk about my father." Marianne turned pale instantly. The keys slipped from her hand onto the counter with a dry clink. She sat down slowly, as if her body no longer had the strength to stay upright. "Sweetheart, we've talked about this. Your father, he died before you were born." Ella's voice trembled, but there was a new firmness in every word. No. He's alive. I saw him today. He walked into the diner. Signed a document, and I recognized the signature. It was the same as the one on the photo I found when I was 8. The silence that settled between mother and daughter was suffocating. The small apartment, with its peeling walls and simple furniture, suddenly seemed smaller than ever, as if it couldn't contain the truth now coming to light. Ella remembered the questions she had asked as a child about what her father was like, what he liked to do, why he had left so soon. Marianne had always answered with short phrases, averting her eyes, offering hugs as a distraction. At the time, Ella accepted it. But now, all those vague answers felt like sharp knives. How many nights did I cry alone not knowing who I really was, she thought, feeling her throat burn. Every word her mother had said now carried the weight of a repeated lie. Marianne brought her hands to her face as if trying to hide from the truth now imposing itself. The tears came before the words. My God, fate hasn't spared me after all. Ella leaned forward, her eyes burning. Why, Mom? Why did you lie to me all these years? Marianne took a deep breath, her voice breaking with guilt. I was 18, Ella. Young, scared, and pregnant. Your grandparents said he was no good for me, that he had no future, that he would ruin my life. They told me if I didn't hide everything, I would lose the little I had. I was alone, desperate, and I ended up believing them. So you made me believe he had died? Ella's pain sounded like an accusation, but also like a plea for understanding. I thought it was the best, Marianne confessed, sobbing. I thought I was protecting you, and myself. I thought it would be easier to live with the pain of a loss than with the uncertainty of abandonment. But I never stopped loving him. Never. The memory came like an inevitable wave, pulling Marianne back long before that small apartment suffocated by guilt. She had been only 17 when she met William, at a summer festival by the lake. He was a daring young man, full of energy, with eyes that sparkled as if the whole world were within his reach. Marianne remembered the way he made her laugh that first afternoon, offering her cotton candy and promising he would never let her walk alone. The days that followed were like a dream. They met secretly at the dock, exchanged scribbled notes in school notebooks, and made plans to travel across the country in an old pickup truck he swore he would buy. William spoke of the future with contagious confidence, and Marianne, young and in love, believed every word. Their love was simple, but deep. There was a silent understanding in every glance, as if just being together made the world make sense. Marianne had never felt so seen, so heard, so truly loved. But reality soon imposed itself. Her parents considered him irresponsible, someone with no prospects, incapable of offering stability. That boy will ruin your life, they repeated, until the phrase began to echo in Marianne's mind like a dark prophecy. When she discovered the pregnancy, fear took hold. She didn't have the courage to tell William, afraid he would not be able to handle such a responsibility. The harsh advice of her family turned into unbearable pressure. Disappearing would be the only way to protect the little she had. And so, with a broken heart, she chose silence. Marianne fled without saying goodbye, carrying with her not only a secret, but also the weight of a love cut short. For years, she tried to convince herself she had done the right thing. But in lonely nights, when she looked at her sleeping daughter, she saw in Ella the reflections of the boy who once promised to be her world. Ella closed her eyes, trying to hold back tears, but her voice came firm, laden with both disappointment and tenderness. You took him away from me, Mom. But you also took yourself away from him. You lived two separate lives, when you could have been a family. Marianne reached out her hand, but it hesitated in the air, as if she were afraid of not being forgiven. I know, sweetheart. I was wrong. And now I don't know if he will ever be able to forgive me. The room sank into silence after Marianne's words. Only the steady sound of Ella's breathing filled the space, mingled with the distant ticking of the clock in the living room. The memory still burned, as if the wounds of the past refused to heal. And it was at that moment of fragility, when mother and daughter seemed trapped by what had not been lived, that fate moved once again. The phone vibrated, carrying with it a voice that could no longer be ignored. William, on the other end of the line, carried in his deep tone not only the shock of the recent discovery, but also the old weight of a love cut short by force. "I need to see her. I need to talk to Marianne," he said, almost like a plea. Ella hesitated, but she knew that meeting was inevitable. Two worlds separated for more than 2 decades were about to collide. The following afternoon, Harper's diner was almost empty. The sun streamed through the wide windows, casting golden rectangles of light across the red vinyl booths. William was already waiting in the reserved corner, the same one where everything had begun. His posture, usually impeccable and imposing, now seemed heavy with restrained nervousness. The door opened with the chime of the bell, and Marianne walked in. She wore a simple light blue dress, her hands clasped in front of her body as if seeking protection. Her eyes immediately found his, and for an instant, time itself seemed not to have passed. William rose slowly, each gesture weighted with emotion. "Marianne." The name came out heavy with memories. She answered in a whisper, almost inaudible. "William." There was a silence that seemed eternal. They studied each other, searching in their aged features for the reflection of the young couple they had once been. "You look exactly the same," he said, his voice breaking. "No, I don't," she replied with a sad smile. "Time has left its marks. And I made mistakes that cannot be undone." William drew in a deep breath, as if struggling against the pain. "And I spent 25 years believing you had abandoned me. That you had simply forgotten me." "I never forgot," tears glistened in her eyes. "But I was pregnant, frightened, and everyone told me you weren't good for me, that you would ruin my life. I didn't have the courage to fight them. I ran away." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing every word. "I would have faced the world for you. If I had known, if I had been given a chance." Marianne stepped closer, her movements uncertain. "I know. But I wronged you, and I wronged her." William's hands tightened against the table. He leaned forward slightly, his voice choked with emotions he didn't know how to name. "I built empires, Marianne. I gained everything money could buy. But there was never anyone after you. I never managed to love again." Her tears slipped out in restrained sobs. "Neither did I. I never married. I never managed to move on." The air between them seemed charged with electricity, as if every breath carried the risk of collapse. Time, which had once torn them apart, now returned memories in an avalanche, the smell of the lake where they had taken their picture, the whispered promises on hot summer nights, the plans that had never left the page. William studied every line of Marianne's face, trying to find the girl who once made him believe in the impossible. Marianne, in turn, saw in him the man who could have changed everything and who, by fate or by fear, had been kept away. The coffee cooled on the table, untouched, a silent witness to a story interrupted. Around them, the diner's usual bustle continued, dishes clattered, conversations carried on, but for them, the whole world seemed to have stopped. A profound silence enveloped them, as if the air had grown too dense to breathe. It was no longer the clinking of cutlery or the hum of voices that filled the diner, but 25 years of distance, regret, and love that had never ceased to exist. They remained in silence, as though 25 years of separation could fit into that single moment. The following days were heavy with silence in the small apartment. Ella hardly knew how to organize her own feelings. She still felt the pain of the lie her mother had upheld for so many years, but she also couldn't ignore the presence of William Prescott, no longer just a distant name, but a man of flesh and blood who looked at her as if he had spent his entire life waiting for her. The reunion with Marianne had reopened wounds, but it had also left a door slightly ajar. William didn't try to force his way through. He approached with caution, respecting their space, like someone who knew that any wrong step could drive them away forever. One afternoon, he found Ella sitting on the steps of the building, her college books on her lap. He sat beside her, letting a comfortable silence linger before speaking. I know I can't give back the years I lost, Ella. I can't erase the pain, or the emptiness. But I can be here now. And if you let me, I want to support your dreams. Ella kept her eyes on the cover of one of the books, as if searching for the courage to answer. I don't want you to think you can buy my love. He shook his head firmly. That's not it. I don't want to buy anything. I just want to walk by your side, to know who you are, and to help open doors that might otherwise be harder for you to open alone. I want to be present. She took a deep breath. Distrust still throbbed inside her, but there was something true in his voice, something that broke through the shell of the billionaire used to controlling everything. I don't know if I can trust you all at once, she admitted softly. But maybe we can start slowly. William smiled, a restrained smile, but one full of hope. Slowly is enough. When Marianne learned about that meeting, she was tense at first. Her eyes still reflected fear and regret, as if she expected judgment at any moment. But as the days went by, she realized William didn't come with bitterness or accusations, but with a calm willingness to rebuild. There was no rush in his voice, only the steadiness of someone who didn't want to lose anything more. And little by little, Marianne's rigidity began to give way. There was still hesitation, but also a discreet flame rekindling, as if part of her knew that this man, despite everything, had always been the love of her life. Months passed since that afternoon when hidden truths came to light in a small roadside diner. Ella Monroe's life, once marked by repetition and silent struggle, now gained new colors. With William Prescott's support, she secured a partial scholarship and, combined with her father's financial help, enrolled at a prestigious university in Atlanta. On the vast campus, Ella walked through the hallways with her books pressed to her chest, still surprised at how quickly her world had changed. But more than the financial resources, what truly made the difference was his presence. William wasn't trying to make up for the past with expensive gifts, he was there in long phone conversations, weekend visits, and in the simple act of listening to her talk about her plans for the future. In the first days of class, Ella walked the corridors of the campus with a mixture of wonder and insecurity. The imposing buildings, the enormous library, the students discussing ambitious projects, everything seemed so far from the reality she had known. At times, she felt like an intruder, as if it were written on her forehead that she came from a roadside diner. But all she needed was to remember her mother's effort and her father's newfound presence to find the courage to keep going. William visited her whenever he could, and in their evening phone calls he spoke of business strategies, but also listened in silence when Ella talked about pastry, about dough rising slowly, about recipes she dreamed of creating. He didn't try to correct her or buy ready-made solutions, he simply listened, like someone who understands that the true value lies in being present. Marianne, in turn, approached this reunion with caution. The fear of losing again what she had believed buried for so long still accompanied her. But every gesture from William, every patient look, seemed to slowly dissolve the walls built over years of silence and guilt. Distrust gave way to timid conversations, then to quiet laughter, until little by little they began to rebuild the story interrupted 25 years earlier. Not as if they could erase the past, but as people who understand that time does not erase the truth of love. Inspired by her own journey, Ella decided to create something bigger than her personal achievement. During a class, while listening to a lecture on social leadership, the idea came to her, an organization dedicated to young people who grew up without the presence of a father or a mother. An NGO that would provide emotional support, mentorship, and educational opportunities, so that no one would have to feel the emptiness she had carried for so many years. The first steps were timid, meetings in borrowed university rooms, contacts with professors and friends willing to help. But William, proud, became the greatest supporter of the project, and Marianne, with her practical experience, offered the same careful work as always, turning dreams into concrete actions. Ella then understood that she hadn't just gained a father and rediscovered her mother's love. She had inherited from them something even more valuable, the ability to transform pain into hope, and secrets into new opportunities. Sometimes destiny reveals itself in details so small they might go unnoticed. A signature scribbled on a contract, a glance exchanged in silence, a photograph forgotten at the bottom of a box. Small signs that, when they finally emerge, hold the power to transform an entire life. Ella Monroe learned that true love is never lost with time. It can be muffled by fear, interrupted by choices, or buried beneath secrets, but it never fully disappears. 25 years of distance were not enough to erase the bond between Marianne and William, nor to destroy the truth of a daughter who, even without knowing, always carried within her the mark of who she was. Family connections, no matter how hidden, always find their way back. Time can be cruel, but it also knows how to be just when everything happens at the right moment. And you? What would you have done in Marianne's place? Would you have hidden the truth or told it from the beginning? Share your opinion in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell for more stories that touch the soul.